In Chapter 3, we'll be learning about interpretation because not all texts are easy to read or understand. Sometimes we have to dig a little bit deeper and interpret what the author is trying to say. So this chapter talks about the various skills associated with doing that. I like to start the chapter with a video. Unfortunately, the recordings that I'm doing are limited to 15 minutes apiece, so I'm not going to watch the video as part of this video lecture, but I encourage you to go take a look at the original PowerPoint, watch this clip. It is a clip from Men in Black, and it is a very good example of how one person might interpret a situation very differently than others. Interpretation is something that we all learn how to do over our lifetimes. The better we are at it, the stronger critical thinking I think that we're able to do. So it's worth developing this skill. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify the main ideas and details in a reading. You should know what emotive words are and why they matter. You should understand how to annotate, summarize, paraphrase, outline, and map, which are all various techniques for ensuring that you've interpreted the material correctly. And you should understand 4 types of unclear communication and be able to explain and identify the different types. So there are a variety of terms also that you'll need to know by the end of this chapter. Some of these will be covered in the video, some of them are in your textbook. Intellectual humility is important because we have to understand first that we don't always understand what we're reading, right? If we go into a reading and we think, of course, I'm going to understand everything the first time through, then we won't necessarily take the time to look closer and do a little bit of digging and try to understand what's missing. So it's important to have intellectual humility, to recognize that we don't always know everything and that sometimes we need to slow down and be a little bit more careful and take a closer look at things. So all of these the answers to this are in your textbook if you want to take a look, but essentially what it just means is to recognize that you may very well be wrong. Some information out there is not true and it's easy to be fooled. So you have to be able to say, hey, I don't know. And if you do make conclusions, they should be tentative, right? Be willing to change your mind if you need to. So, identifying the topic, main idea, and details. These are very important skills. Again, they're sort of the foundational skills for this chapter. Keep in mind that the topic, which we talked about in Chapter 2, is not the same as the main idea. Those are 2 different things, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We also are going to learn what emotive words are and how to identify different kinds of details. So, the topic, which we talked about in Chapter 2, was a single word or phrase, whereas a main idea is a complete sentence. The topic is a lot more general or broad, whereas the main idea narrows it down a little bit and tells you specifically what an article is about. The topic may identify the subject, whereas the main idea identifies what the author's point is about that subject. So instead of asking the question or answering the question, what's this about? The main idea answers the question, but what about it? So if you are reading an article and the topic of that article is vegetarians, that could mean a lot of things. The main idea that the author wants to get across might be that vegetarian diets are healthier. But there are technically 1,000 different main ideas that could go along with the topic of vegetarians. If I asked every student in a class to write a different paper about vegetarians, you could all come up with different main ideas. One person might say a vegetarian diet is healthier. Someone else might say vegetarian diets are very expensive. Someone else might say vegetarian diets aren't good for children. Somebody else might say vegetarian diets are specifically good for people who have cancer. Someone else might say vegetarian diets are more popular in some areas than in others. right? So the main idea is a very specific point about the topic, and it usually is a complete sentence, a complete thought, whereas the topic is just a word or a phrase. So keep in mind that those are two different things. You should be able to identify the main idea within the text by looking for what we call emotive words. Emotive words might be superlatives, aesthetic words, judgment words, or recommendation words. But if you take a look at these examples on the screen, you'll understand how they might help you identify the author's point about vegetarians, for example, or whatever their topic might be. The details that the author uses to support their main idea is also really important. You're going to be examining both major and minor details in order to try and understand the author's perspective, their bias, their perspective, or their opinion. So these are a list of different types of details. More information about each one is provided in your textbook. You're welcome to take a look. But these are the types of details that you'll need to identify and pull out when we get to analysis and evaluation, which are chapters 6 and 7 in the textbook. But it's important to understand that there are lots of different kinds of details. An author might use stories or incidents from their own life, statistics that they have found through research. They might give reasons or quotations by someone famous or someone authoritative. All of those constitute details or evidence. Authors also use various patterns of organization, and it's important to be able to identify that as well in a text in order to be able to appropriately interpret the point they're trying to get across. So you can look for various patterns of organization by the clue words or transitional words that you'll find in the text that signal to you that a specific pattern of organization is being used. For example, if you see words like first, second, later, next, after, or eventually, that is a signal to you that the author is using a chronological order pattern and that they are presenting their material in time order, right? Chronological order means time order. There are also clue words to help you recognize a comparison pattern or a contrast pattern, a classification pattern, which is when you organize things into groups, an example listing, or a cause and effect pattern. All of those are viable patterns of organizations that an author might use to put their material together and present it. Some things that you can do if you're reading a text and you're not entirely sure whether you're understanding it well, you can try to engage in some of these interpretation strategies to make sure that you do understand. To annotate means to make notes directly on the text, so you would write on your page. You can underline things and circle things and make notes in the margins. Mapping is using a visual system to connect ideas. So like drawing a circle in the middle of the page with the topic on it, and then branching off with different circles for each major detail. You can also outline it, which is a very rigid structure of note-taking where you use letters and numbers and indentations. Your book has examples of all of these patterns of interpretation. Paraphrasing and summarizing are also good ways to make sure that you're interpreting material correctly. Paraphrasing means to take a specific idea and to put it into your own words. And summarizing is essentially doing the same thing but for a longer pattern, longer paragraph or a passage. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. So all of these methods have various advantages and disadvantages, and your book outlines those in great detail. So take a look at that material. Unclear language is the last part of this chapter, and essentially what we're going to talk about are 4 very common ways that language can be kind of garbled, right? We don't quite understand what's being said. And sometimes this is intentional. The speaker is doing this on purpose in order to confuse or deceive you. Other times it might just be laziness or poor speaking techniques. So we're going to talk about these 4 types of unclear language so that you can identify them in the future if you come across them. So the first one is vague wording, and vague basically just means using non-specific language, language that doesn't provide a lot of information. So if somebody answers the question, if you ask someone, you know, what's this person like, and they say, oh, she's nice, that's pretty vague. It doesn't really answer your question, doesn't give you a lot of detail. You might have at some point in your life, if your parents said, well, where are you going? You might have said, oh, I'm going out. And they said, well, when will you be home? Later. Well, who are you going with? Some people, right? Those are all vague answers that are sort of designed to not give a lot of information. So that's one example of vague language. You have to be able to identify this so that you realize you're not getting all the information. Ambiguous language is when a phrase or a sentence can be interpreted in two different ways, and in a lot of cases this is due to the way the sentence is constructed. It might be a comma issue. For example, this first let's eat grandma example could go either way depending on whether or not we put a comma between eat and grandma. Let's eat grandma or let's eat grandma are two different expressions, right? Rachel Ray enjoys cooking her kids and her dogs. She either enjoys those three things, or we should be a little bit worried about Rachel Ray's cooking strategies, right? And then finally, the chicken is ready to eat could mean that the chicken has been cooked and is ready for us to sit down and eat it, or it could mean that the chicken is hungry and is ready to eat its dinner. So ambiguous language is a sentence or a phrase that can be interpreted in more than one way. Euphemism and doublespeak are the last two, and these are easily confused, so it's important to pay attention to the distinction. A euphemism is an expression that we use in our language to kind of cushion something that we're trying to say. It tries to make something less offensive. So instead of saying, I'm sorry your grandma died, you might say, I'm sorry that your grandmother has passed away. That's a euphemism. We're not fooling anyone. Everybody knows what we mean when we say passed away. It just sounds a little bit nicer. So we use euphemisms to try and cushion the blow, so to speak. Saying that we'd have to let someone go instead of fire them, or talking about dinner being a little overcooked instead of saying that it's burnt. All of those things are euphemisms. They're not lies. Everybody knows what we're talking about, but we're just trying to be a little more polite about it. Doublespeak, on the other hand, is when you take euphemism to a whole new level, to a point that you are really, really trying to deceive your audience. You don't want them to know what you're actually talking about. Saying the company will be restructured is corporate doublespeak. They put that out because they can't afford, for their image, right? They don't want to say, we're going to fire a bunch of people. That would look bad. There would be a lot of backlash in the public. Employees would all be upset. So they say the company will be restructured, which they're hoping nobody will really know what that actually means. Similarly, in military strategy, you might hear that there was collateral damage, which basically means that they killed a bunch of people that they weren't supposed to, probably women and children, and they can't go out publicly and say that they did that. So they've come up with this term, collateral damage, which is intended to deceive the average audience member so that it doesn't sound so bad. This is actually a clip here. It's from I think it's a CarMax commercial maybe. So you can see the example here, this slight water damage is definitely doublespeak. It is entirely intended to deceive. So hopefully this has helped. This has helped you understand the 4 types of unclear language and some other strategies that you can use for making sure you interpret texts appropriately.